Fall is my favorite time for reviewing the foundational concepts of playing the harp that are often easy to forget in the hustle and bustle of our everyday practice. Some of you maybe took the summer off, took a break from playing, or maybe it's just a good time to sort of recenter, reground yourself. Maybe you're considering what kind of goals you're working towards this fall and this winter. So I just wanted to go over a couple of things that you probably know, but is easy to just sort of lose sight of when we're so focused in on what our fingers are doing. And speaking of fingers, today I want us to talk about the rest of the body besides the fingers in how we sit at the harp. So this is, again, probably something that your teacher went over with you in your very first lessons. But, you know, as we play and we're so focused on notes and finger technique and rhythms and all these things we have to think about, it's really, really easy to tune out what the rest of your body is doing. We tend to get tunnel vision on what's going on at the fingers, and everything else, we just say, I don't know, let's just let that go on autopilot. And sometimes our body can start to do things that we didn't even realize that it was doing. So today I want to take a reset how we're sitting at our chair at the harp, so that you can play your best. So a couple things to understand about how we want to organize ourselves at the harp. Excuse me. First of all, the most important thing to understand is that we don't just play the harp with our fingers, we really play the harp with the whole body. So we do want to pay attention to what the body is doing. So what we want to do first is organize ourselves at our bench first and then bring the harp to us rather than the other way around. We don't want to put the harp wherever the harp is going to be and then adjust ourselves to the instrument. So we're going to start just with how we're sitting away from the instrument. So another really important thing to understand about how to sit is that our whole body is kind of set up around this concept that we've got this big heavy melon up on top of a little stick. In terms of balance and gravity, it's a little bit of a precarious position. So what happens is, and we'll actually maybe do a little activity here. So what I want you to do is start just sitting neutral on your chair. And then I want you to lean forward a little bit and see if you can notice if any muscles start activating, if any muscles start working a little bit harder than they were before. Now, you don't have to hold this for a super long time. You can come back to neutral. And then let's do the same thing, leaning back a little bit. I notice definitely my lower back starting to work when I lean back, probably my neck a little bit too. And if you lean to one side or the other, you'll probably notice the side of the body starts to wake up and is kind of holding us up. The reason being is that when our head is centered over top of our bones, right? So our neck, our rib cage, our spine, our hips, the bones hold up the weight of our head without having to work too hard, right? A bone doesn't really do much. It's just there. It just exists to bear weight. And so when we move off center, when we move off balance and our head is no longer over top of our bone structures, muscles have to get involved because otherwise this weight of our head would pull us to the floor. So what our goal is really when we're sitting with the harp is we want to sit in such a way that no muscle group is working any harder than any other muscle group. So what that really means is sort of like I just said, we want our head centered, kind of, you can think above your shoulders or above your rib cage, above your spine, above your hips. And again, what that's going to do is just allow your bones to take the weight of your head so that you don't have to be working so hard just to sit. Now, to this point, I also just want to bring up this phrase, sit up straight. Maybe you've heard it before. Oftentimes, when a student hears this phrase, we tend to think of this very militant kind of puffing our chest out, pulling the shoulders back, maybe lifting the chin a little bit, maybe kind of, I'll pull my shirt tight here so you can see, like kind of pushing the lower back in a little bit. But that's actually not what we want at the harp. What we want at the harp is for things to be as easy, relaxed, comfortable as possible. And sitting up straight like that, it's not super comfortable. What we really want is something neutral. Again, so we don't want to be forcing any one part of our body this way or that. It's just, I like to think about the spine, the vertebra, almost like a building block tower. That's not exactly how the anatomy works, but I just like to think of each bone kind of stacked on top of the one below it so that the head can balance on the top. Now, let's talk a little bit about our chair. So, how high you sit is going to depend a little bit on the type of harp you play, and we're going to talk about pedal harp in just a moment. But a couple of good rules of thumb. Number one is we never want to see your knees coming above your hips. So if that's happening, you want to be sitting a little bit higher. And then when you're actually sitting on your chair, we want to make sure that we're sitting on the flat part of your sit bones. And if you don't know what I mean by that, we're going to do another activity. So take your hands. I want you to sit on your hands for a second and see if you can kind of like rock back and forth a little bit on your hands. And you can maybe feel that there's sort of a round part of that bone that you're sitting on, and there's a flatter part. Now you can imagine sitting on something round, not super stable. So we want to sit on the flat part of that sitting bone. How do we do that? Well, a really good way to do it is, can't see my head for a second, when you're sitting down, if you kind of stick out your butt behind you as you sit, you'll be sitting on the flat part of your sit bone. Okay, so last thing before we get to the harp, we want to make sure our feet are flat on the floor as much as possible. If your feet do not reach the floor, you've got a couple of things you can try. Number one, you can just sit a little bit farther forward on your bench. And actually, in general, I do recommend sitting towards the very front edge of your seat. I know I'm black on black here, but you don't want to be sitting way back here. It ends up putting more of our weight kind of on our legs, and that's not really the part that we're supposed to be sitting on. We're supposed to be sitting on those sit bones. So a little bit farther forward is going to be helpful. Can also help you reach the floor if your legs are a little bit shorter. You can wear a shoe with a heel. You can have like a footstool or something like that if you're playing a lever harp or a pile of books. But those feet on the floor are again going to help stabilize us so that different parts of your body, your muscles, aren't working to stabilize you. Okay. Now we want to think about how are we positioning the harp to us, right? Again, we don't want to position ourselves to the harp, but the other way around. So again, I'm going to talk about pedal harp more specifically in a second, but with a lever harp, generally what we want is so that when you place your hands sort of in the middle of the string in terms of height, about, not too high, not too low, we want the hands to be sort of just below where your heart sits, maybe slightly lower, maybe just somewhere around there. We don't want the hands to really get above that, because if I do that, a couple things start to happen. Number one, it gets a little harder for your heart to pump blood upwards, just a little bit. But the other thing is that my upper arm starts to get more involved to hold my arms up. And that's going to make my shoulders really tired really fast. That might make my neck start to get tired. So what I really want is for very relaxed shoulders. You don't need to be pushing them downwards or anything. We want it neutral. We don't want them to be really working at all. We want them to just be hanging out. And in fact, when we have the arm here, it's good to have your elbow just away from your body. So we don't need elbows way up in the sky. I suppose elbow position can be different depending on the method of harp that you've been taught. But the way that I usually like to approach things is we don't need elbows way up in the sky. We just want out away from the body. So a little bit of space at the armpit here. The more you tuck in, the more everything is going to tense up. You're not going to get support for your fingers from the elbow. It's going to make things quite a bit harder, especially for your left hand too. So when we've got that position of about a little bit below your heart, that allows for the elbows to be away from the body at a comfortable height that's not straining the shoulders either. Now, another thing we want to keep in mind with the lever harp in particular. So we want to be able to look at those fingers in the middle of the harp without having to lean around to the side, because remember, that way, you can see how far I'm leaning now. That's going to make a lot of muscles be working that don't need to. So we don't have to turn around to the side. We also don't want to have to crank the neck and really look down or do anything uncomfortable with the neck. So we want to be able to look at the fingers comfortably. So that's what I would say are some good guidelines for how high or low to sit. So if you're finding that your hands are a little too high, you may want to move your seat a little higher. If you don't have an adjustable bench, you can find some cushions around the house or even some towels or blankets that you can kind of pile up a little bit at a time to find a good comfortable height. If your hands are too low, you can try lowering your seat, but again, not past the point of your knees raising above your hips. We don't want to cross that point. So if your hands are too low on your harp, or you've placed them in the middle of the string, but comparatively you're finding it's maybe your elbow doesn't really have much bend in it because of how low you're placing your hands, then you may want to raise your harp up, actually. So you can again find maybe some boxes that are large enough, or depending on your harp, there may be like adjustable legs or something like that. But we don't want to get so low with the chair that we're going to be hurting our hips. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with the harp, where it's situated, how close or far away should it be from you? So with a lever harp, generally, I think we want to place it so that it's not so close to you that it feels like it's going to fall forward, but not so far away that that most of the weight of it is sitting on your shoulder. Most of the weight of the harp should be on the floor. We can sort of cradle the back of the harp with the knees if your knees reach. You don't want to be squeezing there, but just sort of like allowing the harp to rest there. So there's going to be a little bit of weight on the knees. And then really, we want very, very little weight on the shoulder at all. So if you're finding that your right shoulder is getting tired, if it feels really heavy, you may want to try bringing your harp closer towards you or moving yourself closer to the harp so that it's not leaning quite so far, so that more of the weight is on the floor. Okay, and then the last thing, very important thing, is the harp should be at a little bit of an angle across the body. Now, I'm going to just turn myself for a second here. So when I'm sitting comfortably with this, you can kind of see my harp is moving across my body. So this part of the harp is called the column. The column is going to be angled a little bit towards your left. And then I also find for me, when I'm playing comfortably, this part of the harp right here, which is called the knee block, sits kind of towards the outside of my shoulder. So if you've been playing with your harp sort of straight out, you probably will notice a couple of things. It's pretty hard for the left hand to reach these low strings. You have to kind of reach around, and it gets pretty hard to see the strings when they're all in a straight line. So when we turn the harp at more of an angle, my left hand doesn't have to reach as far because I've brought the far end of the harp more to the left. I can see more space between each string, so that's going to make it easier to see. And then the other thing it does a little bit too is when you play your thumbs, if your harp is straight out, your thumb is going to be just pushing the harp straight ahead. And so sometimes that may make your harp rock a little bit and feel unsteady. When we're at a little bit more of an angle, even though my thumbs are still playing forward, that angle is not the same angle that my harp is facing. So it's going to help the harp feel a little bit more stable. Now mine will rock a little bit still because I have a light carbon fiber harp, but generally speaking, that angle is really, really important. It's something that a lot of people tend to forget. So with all that said about the lever harp, let's talk for a second about the pedal harp. So when it comes to figuring out where to sit with your pedal harp, the first place to start, I think, is finding your harp's balance point. So if you pull your harp back, you can try to find the spot where if you let go of it, just staying very close by with your hands, if you let go of the harp, it will stay there for a moment before tipping one way or the other. So if you can find that balance point, that's the angle that we want the harp to be tilted back at. So when you find that, you can just bring yourself and your bench so that you're sitting right at that point. And then you can kind of feel like, okay, am I still sitting up straight? I know myself, I have a tendency to lean back without realizing it. So when I'm sitting neutrally, I'm sitting up straight. This might feel a little too close for me, so I'm just going to scoot my bench back a little bit. And then this way, again, we've got most of the weight on the floor. This is really important because these are big, heavy harps. Most of the weight's on the floor, a little bit resting on my knees, not squeezing, just resting there. And then really very little weight on my shoulders, so I can lean back, and that doesn't really affect what was holding up the harp in the first place. Now, in terms of where to put your hands here, I think my hand is going to be a little bit lower on my body compared to what it looked like on my lever harp. That said, something else to keep in mind is that how each person's body looks on each different harp is going to be a little bit different. So what looks right for me may not look the same for you. I'm quite tall, so my head comes up past the knee block on this harp. That may not be the case for you, and that's totally okay. So here again, I think the most important thing is that we don't have hands coming up sort of above that point of where your heart is, because again, we don't want the shoulders and the upper arms to be working too hard, but we still want some bend in the elbow. So we don't want to be placed so low that the elbow comes out straight. And one way I like to think about the arms and the elbows kind of coming off the shoulders is if you think about your shoulders as a coat hanger, and then the elbows just kind of hang off of it. And then we're going to have our hands come up nicely on the string so that we're not working too hard in the shoulder and we're not dipping too low either. So in terms of how high or low to sit at the pedal harp, I think the main thing to keep track of is, again, where do your hands comfortably sit in about the middle of the string, and how does that relate to sort of your body, your heart? If you feel that your upper arms are lifting too much, maybe your hands are a little higher than your heart, you can try raising your seat a little bit so that when your hands are in the same place, they'll be hanging a little bit lower compared to your body. And if you feel like your hands are sitting a little too low on the string, when you've got a comfortable bend in the elbow, you can try raising your seat so that you can keep that comfortable bend, comfortable angle in the arm, but come a little bit more to the center of the string. I hope this was helpful. I know I really like to reassess my posture and sitting position every time I sit down to practice, so I hope this was a good reminder. And if you're in the market for a new harp teacher, my harp studio is currently taking new students, so if you'd like to see if we'd be a good fit, you can book a call with me by using the link in the description of this video. And bye for now.